Hello, I'm Benjamin Miss. Welcome back to the second part of our introduction to Introduction to Psychology. I mentioned that we were going to be looking at some major modern perspectives, and that includes these. And what's interesting is even though we do consider them modern, there's quite a bit of change that's happened over time, some of them being, dating back to very early psychology. And we start with the psychodynamic. Well, when we think of psychodynamic, we also think of psychoanalytic. And whenever we think of these terms, Freud comes to mind, like the leading person. And I mentioned before, when you ask people, hey, who's, the most famous psychologist you can think of, people will usually mention Freud. And so we're looking at what influenced Freud and why Freud was the way that he is. And I think it's important to look at the influences on him because Freud was absolutely brilliant. All right, we look at on this list, we see intelligence. Freud had taught himself multiple languages as a child, had taught himself multiple languages, was a very scientific mind, and there's no doubt that he would have at any point in history been an excellent researcher given the opportunities. And he was fortunate because he was intelligent and he was able to kind of work through and achieve. Now we're also looking at time period, religious influence and prejudice, and family. Well, the time period was Victorian. And when we think about Freudian attitudes towards things like sex, Freud, we could absolutely consider like an entire era of sexual repression, right? A time when the fact of women having orgasms, does that even exist, right? And is that even something that is considered in terms of sex and sexuality? So we're talking about a very different era in that regard. We're also talking about growing up in the 1800s, the late 1800s, early 1900s, and watching the rise of Nazism as a Jew. And so Freud had a lot of anger because he saw how poorly his family was treated. And he also saw, for instance, that he wanted to become a research scientist. And while he certainly would have been incredibly capable, he was pushed out because of the quota and basically allowing a very few people who were Jews to have those positions. Now we look at his family and we say his family was interesting too, because we know that Freud had a lot of stuff about like mothers and fathers and some of these complexes. And well, Freud's mother was the second wife of his father, and his father had two sons who were basically the same age as Freud's mother. So his uncles are basically, his half-brothers are basically the age of his mother, trying to keep family straight. And his father is quite a bit older. Freud also, at his birth, it was almost kind of like a prophecy that, he will do great things. And so it's kind of had this special place in his family where he was one of the only people who had their own private space, while the rest of the family was kind of packed into a smallish area. So we're looking at what are the influences on him. And we see that. Now, look at some of these terms you may have heard. These are things that are common in society. And, narcissism, was something that was discussed quite a bit by Freud, right? We see that culturally. You look at any, social media. Who are the people who are, selling themselves, who are out there, who are looking for attention? What does that say? And what would Freud say about that? Free association was part of the whole idea of, the classic lie on the couch and talk about just whatever comes to mind, and the psychologist sits there, interesting. What does that mean to you? Libido is Freud's term for the sex drive. Neurosis, right, the kind of maladaptive thinking. Oedipus complex, mentioned kind of Freud's attitude about things. So, Freud famously said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, because Freud would say all these things were representations, like the cylindrical kind of long cigar. It represents a phallus, a penis. And so Freud, when Freud would look at kind of women's psychology and say, well, their problem is that they don't have a penis, and they wish they did. And so he had a very kind of skewed view of things that, not accepted. But so you look at this idea where Freud's, smoking his cigar, and they're like, well, what does that represent a penis to you? And he's like, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Well, one of the things we think about with Freud is what he said, and his theories probably tell us more about Freud than they tell us about people, right? Now, maybe they tell us about sexually oppressed women in the Victorian era. Maybe he's got some good data on that. But whether this translates to a modern world is the question. The Oedipus complex is similar, right, into that. This tells us more about Freud. So the Oedipus complex, you may have heard of. This was a story of Oedipus where it was prophesied that the king would have a son who would kill him. And like the Greeks like to do in their mythologies and their stories, they created this whole where the king basically put Oedipus, his son, on this mountain to die, or had someone go get rid of the kid, but they left the kid to die, and somebody found the kid and raised the kid, and then later on the kid kills the king, and it happens to be his father, and then marries the mother, and then hijinks and tragedy ensue, right? And so Freud's view of the Oedipus complex was that, boys have this innate desire to kill their father and marry their mother. Same thing with the cigar in this case. Maybe it tells us more about Freud than it tells us about the rest of us. Projection is wanting to associate with those that are successful or putting your issues elsewhere. Psychosis has a very specific meaning. So you've heard of people, it's like, oh, that's psychotic. That person's behaving psychotically. Doesn't mean violent. Psychosis is a disconnect from reality. And when we think of psychosis, we think of people who maybe are hallucinating or having severe delusions. Repression is the idea that you're ignoring something that's a pretty big deal because it's causing too much stress for you. And sublimation would be Freud's taking, a negative drive and turning it into something positive. And this is the idea of Freud seeing everything you do that's good being you just trying to sublimate or repress or your dark urges. Freud saw people extremely darkly, extremely negatively. But again, can we blame him? Freud was raised in a fairly poor family at a time where he was literally watching the rise of this white supremacist nationalism and saw, basically escaped before, the decimation of that was happening in Germany and Austria. So, very interesting time periods and influences. And modern psychologists, do you think maybe they have the same kinds of influences? Do researchers, are they a factor of their time? With Freud, it's very clear. Freud gave us some interesting ideas like the states of the conscious, like conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, where the conscious is, well, what you're attending to. So if you're watching this and paying attention, you are conscious of this. The preconscious being anything you could bring to mind. What did you have for breakfast? Who was your favorite person? These things come to mind very quickly. And then the unconscious being those things that are driving us, but not accessible to us. He looked at the main components of personality and described the id, ego, and superego. And we'll talk more about Freud when we talk about personality because he had a very powerful effect in that field. But the id is our impulses. It's what do you want, right? The drive to survive and reproduce. You're in class and somebody's eating something that looks tasty. You want to take it from them. That's the id. The ego is the part of our psyche that wants to get our ids needs met, but in socially acceptable ways. So, you want food, you go buy it from the store, or you say to your friend, hey, can I have some of that, right? And the superego is our conscience. It is the better part of us. And Freud believed it was learned through family. I mentioned the defense mechanisms. And then when we look at the criticisms of Freud, what do we see? Well, they were theories that attempted to explain the world around him, but they aren't very testable, right? Very philosophical in the sense of, arguing, well, James's discussions of consciousness are philosophical. Freud's discussions of how do you test this? How do you test, where the id is? Small n means a small sample size. And a lot of research often comes from small n's that can be good. Ebbinghaus, he tested himself, an n of 1, right? N is a stats number that tells you the sample size. Piaget, who studied children, tested his kids, a very small n, and yet they were typical, and he did a nice job doing it, and what he learned was pretty applicable. But Freud's stuff wasn't very testable. It described the world, but it wasn't, how do you get into there? And to this day, if there's Freudian ideas that, people will find ways to test and show aren't really the case. So we ask if it's still useful. Well, I would say yes. I mean, Freud's idea that the big takeaways, right, that childhood experience influenced us as adults, that's a big deal, right? And we absolutely believe that's the case. Neurotic symptoms, mental health issues, are often linked to psychological trauma. We know that there's mental processes that we're not aware of. We know that we have impulses, and we can see these impulses in the brain. Our, sense of self, we do get defensive, and we look at how much of behavior is based on biology, sexuality, gender roles, and family dynamics. So Freud focused on the effect of childhood, right, and looked at all these things. And Freud was called, a pervert because he talked about sex, right, and sexuality. Because, Victorian, let's gasp and, look away, because that's their attitude towards sex at the time. So, though many ideas were wrong, his influence on modern society is still very powerful. We look at, for instance, some of his ideas, Eros and Thanatos, these drives, conflicting drives in the person. And so Freud, it wasn't all bad, but it was pretty negative, right? So what do we see? We see Eros, love, is the drive to create, right? Thanatos is the drive of aggression, sadism, death. And so Freud saw, that there was this kind of back and forth, and asked, now that we've created, from this world, we have the methods to destroy ourselves, right? Humanity could destroy itself through war and through explosions. And what are people going to do? What's going to win? Eros or Thanatos? We then go into a very different direction, and the behaviorists, right? So we've got Watson and Skinner. Watson was an interesting and problematic figure that ended up getting pushed out of academia and going into advertising, and kind of brought let's use psychology for evil in a lot of ways, and it still is, to that matter, today. Looking at how can we, maybe you're a business student, and we're looking at, I'm not saying it's evil, but I'm saying let's use this to manipulate people to get them to buy things that they don't want, right? And so Watson argued that take a child and he could turn it into whatever, wealthy industrialist, poor beggar. It was all about conditioning. The SR model, which stands for stimulus response. Skinner, like Thorndike, were looking more at other types of conditioning, reinforcement and punishment. And the two main types of conditioning we talk about are classical conditioning and operant conditioning, right? Classical conditioning is like the Pavlov dogs. The operant conditioning goes on to how can you train through reinforcement and punishment. Well, in the first half of the 20th century, it had a very powerful effect, especially in the United States. Not all bad, because remember, if everything's learned, how should we invest? How should we educate? What should be our focus as a culture? But they ignored the mind. They said what's happening in the mind doesn't matter. What matters is actions. So you looked at what was the environment like and what did people do? Well, ignoring the mind was fine. And at the time, a lot of good research came out of there. Skinner tried to get the military to fund his pigeon-guided missiles. Before you had remote kind of guided missiles, Skinner had a design of training a pigeon, putting it in the cone of a missile, and teaching it how to drive the missile by pecking, and in order to hit a target. The military thought this was ridiculous, it wasn't, but I mean, imagine a pigeon guiding a bomb. And they said no, but the idea of conditioning and teaching absolutely worked. But what happened was, in the early 20th century, EEG was invented. And as computing power got better and better, more of these methods of neuroscience allowed us to look into the mind, right, and see what was actually happening. And so behaviorism was like, we don't care at all, we're ignoring it. The cognitive side started to say, well, there's something there. I mean, there's this kind of like SOR model, right? Stimulus organism response. What's happening in the organism? Do you always behave the same way to the same stimulus? Absolutely not. And with the development of the modern computer, the information processing view, people started to see the components of the mind and how much that was involved. The behaviorists ignored the idea of voluntarism, of functionalism, of all these kind of like, motivational conscious things. They didn't care. And then Skinner wrote a book called Verbal Behavior, where he tried to argue that language was learned entirely through reinforcement and punishment. And Noam Chomsky, was at MIT and read this and was like, no, absolutely not. Children have a motivation to learn. And he wrote this critique that was dozens of pages long, basically shredded behaviorism. He attacked the application of behaviorism to learning as superficial, argued for these, the child's internal motivation to learn, the idea of nativism, which is you've got certain preset things in your mind for language, and that, and then kind of create this idea of generative grammar, which is children, we all create sentences we've never heard, which means it can't be just conditioning. There has to be more to it. You may have heard the sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Well, this is meaningless semantically, and yet it shows us that it still sounds like language. We have this understanding of structure that goes beyond what we've been conditioned to. So this internal kind of machinery is part of this cognitivist view that Chomsky kind of brought about in the 60s, that led to this explosion of not just like cognitive science, but linguistics and all these things tied together. And as big as psychology is, sometimes the study of language is inside. Specifically, aspects of the study of language are often included into cognitive science research areas. So psychology becomes this huge area of research. And the behaviorists fell out of favor, but there's nothing wrong with the behaviorist techniques. The problem is saying this is the only thing. And these debates continue to go on. Nurture and nature. Behaviorist nurture, cognitivist, nativist nature. Going back and forth saying what's important. Let's consider how we know things and errors children don't make. And this was part of the genius of Chomsky, was seeing there's errors that children don't make that they should make. So consider this. You are a student. What do we move to turn this into a question? Well, you would usually say we would move the R. This is called subject auxiliary inversion, right? So you take, are you a student? And yet we take a sentence like this. Anyone who is a student can come to class. Well, now we turn that into a sentence, but we've got two auxiliaries. Children never move the first one, even though they should. So it's a mistake they never make. They seem to understand that who is a student actually modifies anyone, and that the key auxiliary in the sentence is can. Anyone can come to class. Who is a student tells us something about the anyone. So children don't make this mistake, even though they should. And so Chomsky would say, well, this isn't learnable just from children's observing. So therefore, there must be some kind of innate language ability that children have. They're only presented what's called positive evidence, which is, here's what speech sounds like. They're never told, you can't say it like this, even though they don't make those mistakes. They make predictable mistakes, right? They say things wrong. But again, these are predictable mistakes, and the fact they don't make these other mistakes is interesting. And Chomsky's influence went well beyond psychology well beyond language, in the humanities and the arts. A survey was done in the early 90s that showed that for the decade before, he was one of the 10 most quoted writers. And what's interesting about that is he was the only living one. The rest of them were people like Plato and Freud and the Bible and Aristotle, Cicero. So you look at this kind of impact of a living person on these fields, and it was wild. So this debate continues, and Chomsky's nativism influenced our modern cognitive psychology perspectives. So you think of, for instance, the pieces in modern cognitive psychology, which also includes James's functionalism, the Gestalt. We're looking inside the mind, and this computer metaphor. How is the mind like a computer? What are the components? So this is the part that gets really quite interesting in our modern perspective. And again, cognitive science is a whole other area, a whole other class for that, beyond Introduction to Psychology. So we'll go back to Freud. We'll go back to, Skinner. All right. Descartes believed that knowledge was available innately. He would most argue with who? Who would he, agree with? Structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, or nativism? And the answer is nativism. Chomsky's nativism. The kind of, we have these preset things. Locke believed that all knowledge was learned through sense experience. Who would he agree with? Skinner, Chomsky, Freud, or Ramon y Cajal? And the answer is Skinner. So we're linking now our philosophers with our modern thinkers, right? With our modern psychologists. The same discussions, the same debates have been happening for hundreds of years, in some cases, thousands. So now let's look at other perspectives, other modern perspectives that we consider that are important in our understanding of psychology. Well, let's talk about humanism. Humanism is the term humanism is no longer popular because the hippies in the 60s loved it, and so they ended up kind of, it got ignored. And it came back decades later as what's called positive psychology, which is, instead of looking at kind of Freud's negative view of people, it was, how do people want to be the best they can be? What drives people to to succeed and have good lives? So instead of Freud's kind of very deterministic view of things, people want to grow and create a better world for themselves and others. And so they looked at things like how we see ourselves. And so the therapeutic direction was, how does our self-concept, how do we see ourselves, and how does this drive decision making? So humanistic therapy would focus on kind of seeing yourself positively and using that to drive, not looking for associations and what drives us, but taking the driver's seat. Here we see some major people, Maslow, Rogers, and Frankl. And what's really fascinating about this is Frankl compared to Freud. So Freud, Jewish, growing up during the rise of this really negative view towards his people. Frankl, also Jewish, being put in a concentration camp, having his family wiped out, okay, barely surviving and seeing the horrors, the absolute horrors. And those survivors, like himself, talking about having to do things to survive, right? Basically, the horrors that they experienced and partook in. And he beat the odds, right? Frankl should have died. He had medical training, which was used by the Nazis, and ended up, escaping and surviving. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which is about his experiences in the, Holocaust and the death camps, and also his view of therapy, which was about kind of logical, called logotherapy. And there was also this kind of branch of existential psychology he was a part of, like him and Rollo May, where they looked at how can they take how can we create meaning for ourselves? How can you take whatever a person is and help them to create a world with meaning of their own, like this existential drive that's somewhat related to the humanism branch. So here we're seeing people as positively. It's basically good. And so you've got, so why? How can you go through such horrors and see the positivity? And I think that was the special thing about humanism is the time period again. Now we're talking World War II is over. The good guys beat this great evil, and the world was full of possibility. And we saw these positive drives overcoming. A famous piece from Maslow is this hierarchy of needs, where you're looking at, people kind of interpret it as, you need one than the other. But it's more looking at, these are all the things we need in order to be complete, in order to feel what he would call self-actualized, right? We obviously need our physiological needs met: safety, security, social interaction in people, feelings about ourselves, and then applications, interesting things. Binet, you may have heard this name because the Stanford Binet IQ test was one of the first intelligence tests. And IQ began being measured in intelligence and what we call psychometrics. And one of my early experiences in psychology was through testing, right? Giving tests to figure out people's abilities. Psychometrics is about measuring the component, the qualities of the mind and what people are capable of. And what's useful about this is it came about in the early 20th century, again, because of war. Well, you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being drafted into the military. What do you do with them? Who is like going to be, who do you want fixing the Jeeps? Do they have Jeeps? I don't know. Who do you want fixing the mechanical stuff? Who do you want figuring out logistics? Who do you want holding a rifle on the front lines? Who do you want leading? Test them. Figure out ways to test people and figure out what their abilities are, and then find out the best places to put them. So these tests became quite well used. And there was something that Pinker writes about called the Flynn effect, which is IQ tests have been rising since the beginning of testing. And it's believed this is because of improvements in education and science and abstract thinking. And for instance, if you had an average IQ today, but you took a 1910 IQ test, you would score near genius level. So you think about how intelligence has changed due to education and opportunity. Certainly, I would think nutrition might be part of that too. Well, one of the other people mentioned in an earlier question was Ramon y Cajal. Well, Santiago Ramon y Cajal was a Spanish neuroscientist, and what we see, this image here was one of his drawings. Cajal, great story, wanted to be an artist. Parents said, no, you're going to medical school. Certainly you know people who've had this experience. And so he became a physician, but designed and built his own microscopes, and drew neurons, by looking at them and seeing how they were configured and connected in such a way that there is no modern drawing of neurons that is better, right, in terms of artistic renditions. Cajal was ahead of his time, won the Nobel Prize, and debated with Golgi, who he shared the prize with, about who was right about, do neurons grow into each other? Cajal said no. And the very fact, the synapse is ridiculously small. I don't know how he saw it with his microscopes, and I think that he also had exceptional vision. Neuroscience is about the relationship between the structures in the brain and our mind and behaviors. So what's happening in the brain? And this is a great area of research and understanding. And is also part of kind of like the rapid rise of psychology, because it wasn't until the mid-1800s that we really started to get an idea of what was happening. Evolutionary psychology seeks to explain psychological processes in terms of why, right? What is the reason that we've developed these abilities? And this gets into all sorts of interesting and problematic areas. Well, why did we develop depression, schizophrenia? Language, we might tell a story about, but the problem is it's telling stories. There's an incomplete fossil record, especially for the brain. Right? Brains don't preserve very well. And so understanding why things are is interesting. And there's a great amount of literature and speculation attempts to explain why we have this various abilities. The sociocultural perspective is tied in with anthropology. It's culture. And we have to be careful with what's called cultural relativity, which is viewing cultures as different, but remembering that they're neither inferior or superior. And this is important in psychology, and it reminds us that studying other cultures tells us what's possible for humans. If we study the Piraha in the Amazon and we see how their experiences and how their mind works, we have a wonderful understanding of what is possible for humans, tribes, different civilizations, styles of government. Allow us to see what people can do and adapt to. So our basic areas of modern study are these. These are huge areas that are widely studied where people can go in and do research. And each of these I mentioned, just like the other list, could be its own course, could be multiple courses, could be a major, could be multiple majors at different schools, graduate studies, doctorates. There's so much available. And we'll talk about each of these areas, right? Each of these areas will be touched on as we go through. In addition to more, we don't even have here the, psychopathology, which is mental illness, which we get to later in the course. But first, we have to understand the mind and how it works in a typical mind before we consider the atypical. When we look at what people do with psychology, the biggest applications are clinical, counseling, educational, industrial, organizational, IO, which includes things like human resources and health. And we look at careers. Where do people go with psych degrees? Well, universities and hospitals are the majority, and then government and other businesses and areas, and some practices that are independent. But when you look at the doctorates, but doctorates are only part of it. Something that's important to know is if you want to be a psychologist, if you want to do psychology as a career, you are very likely going to need advanced degrees. Now, other big areas that are emerging are things like big data. Psychologists are well suited because the modern program tends to emphasize math, computer science, and then being able to kind of do these big picture things with scientific methods, statistics, and putting these things together. Well, so what about a bachelor's? What do you do with a bachelor's in psychology? What's interesting is for people who are interested in various areas outside psychology, psychology can still be a very useful degree. So managers, sales, social work, these are areas that people go into with psychology. So a lot of people with these various degrees will go into these areas. And so that gets us some really cool kind of branching out and kind of very usefulness of psychology. So you want to do the clinical, the counseling, the research. You tend to need at least a master's degree or a doctorate. And the master's has to be very focused for the clinical stuff, family therapy, counseling, and then doctorates for research, for like a psychologist, right? A clinical psychologist is a PhD, right? Where a counselor could be a master's degree. So you're looking at different focuses depending on what you want to do and what area you're interested in. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this introduction, and I hope that you're willing to continue to study and dive into these areas in more depth. IntroPsych, I think, is a lot of fun because we get to look at these really interesting historical studies and applications in our modern world. We even ask questions about things that are affecting us quite powerfully today. Prejudice, stereotypes, convincing people of things through persuasion. Very cool areas of research and understanding our mind, who we are, what makes us human, and what is our future. Thank you, and I look forward to future discussions.